It's really my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Rush Doshi. Rush is the CV Starr Senior Fellow for Asia Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations and an assistant professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown, the Walsh School of Foreign Service, where his research focuses on Chinese strategy and U.S.-China competition. And it's perfect for this conference here today. He previously served as the Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council, helping to shape U.S. policy at pivotal moments in the relationship, right? He's also the author of The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order. Mike McFall, who just left, he teaches a class here. Oh, here's he's teaching that book next week to his class. It's and I've read it. It's a fantastic book. It's an influential, widely cited work that has helped frame how policymakers and scholars understand Beijing's long-term ambitions. Since leaving government, his writings and commentary have attracted particularly wide interests, helping to shape ongoing debates of both policy and academic circles. Rush brings a rare combination of scholarly rigor and first-hand policy experience. So what we bring together here is all in our one keynote speaker. And we're honored to have him help us reflect on the themes of today's discussion and look ahead to where U.S.-China relationship may be headed. Please join me in welcoming Rush. Yeah, fantastic. And he's going to speak from the podium.
I want to thank you, Scott, for the kind introduction. One of the key lessons from today's three-panel discussions was that we're in the midst of a major technological and geopolitical revolution. And when I had the privilege of serving in government, when I left government to become a professor, an assistant professor at Georgetown, I was proud of the work that we'd done, but I also thought that, maybe given some of these changes, there was a real risk that we were falling behind. We might become dependent on China economically, like in rare earths. We might fall behind China technologically, like in electric vehicles, or we might even be defeated by China militarily in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. These were the trends that we saw, and I could tell from the conversations many in the room have a similar assessment. So today I'll argue that basically the U.S. has to confront three realities. The first one is that scale matters in the rise and fall of world powers. The second one is that China has scale, as our first panel illustrated, unlike anything the United States has ever faced. And the third kind of key takeaway is that we can't match that scale alone. Our only viable path forward, both for achieving domestic renewal, but also for balancing an increasingly formidable China, not containing it, not confronting it, not waging a new Cold War, but balancing it, is to build allied scale with our partners. And that means we have to transform our 80-year alliance architecture away from what it's been, a collection of managed security relationships, to a platform for integrated capacity building across the military, economic, and technological domains. We should stop treating our allies as tripwires or as protectorates or as vassals or as dependents and start treating them as co-creators of capacity and power. So that's a pretty abstract frame. What does that mean practically? Practically speaking, that might mean that Japan and Korea help build American ships and American batteries. And this morning we heard about pharmaceuticals. Well, Korea leads in biotechnology and Japan in legacy API production. Both of them can help us minimize our dependencies. It might mean that Taiwan builds American semiconductor plants, which is happening in Arizona, while the U.S. shares its best military technology with allies, which is happening more frequently now, and all of them come together. And this is the most controversial part, but I believe in it, to pool their markets behind a shared tariff or regulatory wall erected to protect ourselves from China's excess industrial capacity. That $1.2 trillion global goods surplus has implications for our workers and our businesses. That kind of coherent, interoperable bloc with the U.S. at its core would generate aggregate advantages that China alone can't match. And that leads to a really important question, because I first started talking about this a year ago with my old boss, Kurt Campbell, who was the Deputy Secretary of State. But in that intervening year, people have said, wow, Rush, you really got this wrong. None of this is realistic. The new pessimism basically says this can't happen because our alliances have suffered a permanent setback. And I think that that view is wrong. And today, in addition to laying out my argument about allied scale, I want to offer a thesis for why I think allied scale still works. So let's begin with the role of scale in history. Size, we all know, that refers to the dimensions of a country. But scale is the ability to generate efficiency and productivity and thereby outcompete your rivals. For most of modern history, I think that's been a key factor in the rise and fall of great powers. Once countries reach similar levels of productivity, the ones with larger populations, larger markets, larger industrial bases, they scale up and they prevail. Small countries can sometimes jump ahead. Remember, Great Britain began as a dreary island in the northwest corner of Europe, but it had a first mover advantage when it came to the steam engine, and it used that to become a world power. The problem, including for Great Britain, was that once larger countries like Germany and the US and Russia industrialized with that same technology, Great Britain fell behind. From 1870 to 1910, the British share of global manufacturing fell by half. Britain was still growing. In fact, British steel production impressively doubled in that period to 6.5 million tons. But Germany's steel production quintupled to 12 million, and America's grew sixfold to 23 million, 4 times what Great Britain was putting out. Britain's rivals easily outscaled Britain, and they pushed eventually many of its firms out of international markets. Now, British leaders saw the problem coming. In 1883, this British lord, John Robert Seeley, wrote a bestseller, and it worried at the end about the emergence of, quote, highly organized states on a yet larger scale. And he noted that as technology diffused, quote, Russia and the United States will surpass in power the states now called great, much as the great country states of the 16th century surpassed Florence. He feared that Great Britain would be reduced to, quote, the level of a purely European power like Spain. But despite his concerns, Great Britain failed to address what was happening. Eventually, America caught the wave of the second and third industrial revolutions. Think, depending on how you count them, electrification and mass manufacturing, or Thomas Edison to Henry Ford, and it became a superpower. And when the Second World War came, Britain was very fortunate that the country that it had inherited its industrial scale was its own ally. And American industrial scale did all of America's enemies. Hitler called the United States a giant of unimaginable productive capacities. Yamamoto, who architected the attack on Pearl Harbor, told the Japanese leadership he would run wild for 6 months, but then no longer, because of American industry. And Italy's foreign minister feared that they lacked stamina to go against the United States. And ultimately, it was that scale that won World War II and built the post-war order. Today, that sense of daunting scale belongs to China, and the United States appears to be in the position that Great Britain was in a century ago. And take GDP. When you account for purchasing power, and you should if you're thinking about things in strategic contexts, China's economy is now roughly 30% larger than the US economy, and in the 2 decades after China joined the WTO, its share of global manufacturing quintupled to 30%, while the US share halved to less than 15%. The statistics basically speak for themselves, but I'll run through them quickly for illustration. China is 2 to 3 times American industrial capacity, 2 to 3 times American power generation, 3 times American car production, 13 times American steel production, 20 times American cement production, and obviously 200 to 500 times, because we have such a low base, the number almost doesn't matter, US shipbuilding capacity. It's moving up the value chain too. It now produces half of the world's chemicals. That's something people don't realize. Half of the world's ships, actually on track for 3/4 if you look at this year's order book. 67% of the world's EVs, 75% of the world's batteries, 80% of the world's consumer drones, 90% of the world's solar panels, 90% of the world's refined rare earths, and in some of those, 100%. It's seizing the next industrial revolution. It installed half of the world's industrial robots. That was 300,000 to the US, which did 30,000 in 2024. It's about 10x the lead that we have. A total stock of more than 2 million to the US, 400,000. It's leading in 4th-generation nuclear technology that we invented but didn't scale. It's building dozens of nuclear reactors at the 3rd-generation level. It exceeds the US in active patents, as we heard in our second panel, and actually in our first panel, and our top-cited publications. It outspends the US in basic science. And according to the Information Technology and Industry Foundation, which I think is one of the more, there's a lot of reports out there that I don't take as seriously, but this one was good. China's at the leading edge of 6 of the 10 industries that matter for the next industrial revolution. And it's translating that scale to military advantage. It's got the world's largest navy. That navy will now be 1.5 times the US size by 2030. In the next 4 to 5 years, it's going to build 65 major surface combatants, which exceeds the entire European Navy. It's 435 vessels to 300 in the US. That actually translates into firepower. I serve in the Navy Reserve, so I had to count these tubes on these ships. But basically, a decade ago, Chinese warships had 1/10 what we call vertical launch system capability. Of American warships, they're going to exceed the US now by 2027. That's a massive increase in just a decade. And they lead in some important technologies like hypersonics, drones, and quantum communications. I think most importantly, though, we saw last year that China translated this industrial strength into very important geopolitical leverage. That was when it weaponized its chokehold over rare earths against the U.S. twice, first in April, and as Scott alluded to earlier, second in October, forcing the U.S. to basically pull back on our own trade and export control policies. I think what's more unique about this is it marked the first time that an export control was used to force open market access, and particularly American market access. We've never seen that before. That's a massive moment in the history of trade. It also changed the strategic balance between our two countries. I wrote at the time that I thought this was the moment that China truly proved itself to be an equal of the United States, because it could absorb the full weight of American economic coercion, push back with 2 feet. And tomorrow, I think it's quite likely that China will, on current course and speed, push the U.S. out of a lot of high-tech industries. And I don't know what the business model of America will be as a country, and how sovereign America will be if it loses those high-tech industries, which are in many ways what it has left after having lost much other manufacturing. Now, we all know that China has significant problems, and I'm not going to deny that that's true. But two things can be true at the same time. China can be slowing economically and still more formidable strategically. And the timeline of those challenges may not matter on the strategic timeline of the competition. Take demographics. That will be a problem in the long term. The recent birth rate statistics were exceptionally grim. But in the medium term, China's under 15 population grew as a percentage of the total population between 2010 and 2020. That was an echo boom from the Mao era baby boom. And China's current dependency ratio will actually remain below Japan's dependency ratio today for another 20 years, maybe 15 if trends get a lot worse quickly. Robotics and AI will help close the gap. So China has a big problem 30 years from now, but as we were discussing, Scott and I earlier, it may not have as big a problem 15 years from now. Take debt. China's total household, corporate, and government debt is about 300% of GDP, as some were discussing that earlier today. But that's a level probably similar to us and most of the other great powers. Take housing. China's housing market is in real trouble, but we also discussed today that a lot of the credit has been redirected to support industrial policy. And even if that's not sustainable, it just has to be more sustainable than those companies abroad that can't stay in the game very long. As long as it outlasts them, it wins. So given those weaknesses, the question, and given that they don't necessarily materialize in a time frame relevant for the competition, I think the question is, what should the U.S. do? And Lord Seeley and others had an idea 140 years ago for Britain. They called for Britain to find scale to rival larger states through what they termed Greater Britain. Tighter integration with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the empire at large, but ultimately that didn't work. It came to naught. They couldn't quite tell the colonies what to do. They went their own way, and Britain never found scale. But the U.S. doesn't have colonies. It has something that might be more useful for American statecraft, and that's truly capable and equal sovereign allies. And if you take the United States and you add up the European Union, Britain, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, and Taiwan, that coalition is actually quite substantial. It is 3 times China's nominal GDP, but more importantly, it's 2 times China's purchasing power adjusted GDP. It's 2 times the highest estimate of China's defense spending. It's 1.5 times China's global manufacturing share. It's actually 3 times more in active patents and top-sided papers, like the index we saw in the first panel, than China. And it's the top trading partner of nearly all countries. Today, China is, but this group would displace. So obviously, the group outscales China, but that doesn't mean very much. That advantage is entirely theoretical. Unlocking its potential, though, is, I think, the central task of American statecraft in this century, and it's what I spend my policy work thinking about. I think ultimately that means changing our alliance model from one focused exclusively on security to one focused on building allied capacity, or as I call it, allied scale. Now, on the defense side, what might this look like? We want 2-way flows of capacity, allied investment in the weakest parts of the American industrial base, starting with shipbuilding, where Japanese and Korean firms are 2 to 3 times more productive per person than America. Probably means more American technology flowing the other way, submarine technology, advanced missile technology, AI-enabled systems, capabilities that we've historically held back. It probably means the formation of new military units, including ones that are allied, ground-based anti-ship cruise missile battalions, for example. And it probably means serious burden sharing and burden shifting, the kind that's being discussed now in Europe. Pooling that kind of scale in the security dimension also means that allies don't just work with America, they would work with each other. So yes, Japan and Korea might help build American ships, but they can help others build ships too. The US and the UK and Australia will help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS. South Korea is presently helping Europe rearm and reindustrialize with massive sales to Poland. In fact, the Poland-South Korea relationship is one of the most interesting relationships in the world. Poland will never say anything bad about South Korea. Norway and Sweden are capable of selling some of the world's best anti-ship missiles to Indonesia and Vietnam to defend their waters. And France could help India, if it wanted, build the next generation of submarines. Having been involved in AUKUS and having personally been involved in angering the French, the idea that the French might sell subs to India is a kind of novel possibility. Capacity would flow within the coalition in ways that are novel. The economic and tech domains are what bring us all together, so let me talk a little bit about that. Here, I think a shared tariff and regulatory wall is essential because securing the American market or the Japanese market does nobody any good if that market ultimately is dominated by Chinese firms to the detriment of our own prosperity. We're probably going to need common investment screening, common export controls, and common research security protocols so that technology can be shared with allies and not immediately transferred to others. We probably need new mechanisms to coordinate industrial policy and probably some ways to break China's control over key choke points, like in critical minerals. And probably an international industrial investment bank among allies is not a crazy thought. New international architecture to build that capacity is very possible and has been done in the past. And we need an economic Article 5, that comes from NATO's Article 5, so that anytime China uses economic coercion against one country, which is happening right now with Japan, all countries can rise to its defense and push back. And that's common sense. So that's allied scale. But now I have to take on the critique, because the question is any of this even realistic? Is it even possible? I mean, the conventional wisdom says no. They say this is fanciful and irrelevant. President Trump has done too much damage to the alliance system. Let's talk a little bit about that damage. We've seen tariffs imposed on close allies. We've seen threats of territorial seizure against NATO allies in the case of Greenland. An Iran war fought over the flimsiest of pretexts over allied objections, devastating allied economies. We've seen troop withdrawals now announced from Germany. Tariffs on India that are even higher than the tariffs that were on China. Crazy. Silence as China coerces Japan over rare earths. And presidential meddling in the internal elections of partners. This is pretty extreme. Today, foreign capitals are openly discussing how to de-risk from America. They're taking a term that was invented really to apply to China, and they're applying it to the US for the first time because they don't trust this government. Leaders like Mark Carney are boldly, although in my opinion, prematurely, perhaps even imprudently, sketching the map of a post-American order and vocally declaring that it's here. So the strain is pretty significant, and the damage is real. The question is that damage terminal? And my answer is no, and I want to give you a few reasons why. Here's why I think alliances will survive. The first reason is that the alternatives to allied scale are worse for everyone than allied scale. One alternative is to return the world after Trump to a world of spheres of influence, a world divided among the great powers, a world I think that frankly Beijing and Moscow would welcome, each running its own neighborhood with the US running back to the Western Hemisphere. But spheres are unstable, as the political scientist Stacy Goddard has argued. Great powers contest the boundaries of those spheres. They did so after the Napoleonic Wars. They did so after Yalta following World War II. And they can't account for global supply chains, transnational challenges like AI and climate. And they can't balance China given its enormous scale. Retreating to a fortress America might sound good, but it may as well be the Galapagos Islands, completely disconnected from the world, from the evolutionary things happening in technology, leaving us smaller, poorer, less innovative, less secure as the world passes us by. Another alternative is global multipolarity. This is China's preferred concept, same with India, same with Russia. No spheres, but every state for itself. No rules, no fixed alignments either. But this world has all the harms of a sphere of influence world and none of the benefits. And World War I, we should remember, emerged in a multipolar Europe. And of course, it leaves middle powers and small states to fend for themselves, and they won't do very well. A third alternative, which I think is actually not unlikely, is a China-led order, or a partially China-led order, with China first among the equals. Economically, the world will become dependent on China's supply chains, while China remains relatively independent of the world. We heard Professor Barry Naughton talk a little bit about China's drive for self-sufficiency in the first panel. This is the hyper-realized version of that vision. Some call that concept dual circulation. People quibble over whether that's really what dual circulation means in China, but I think it does. Second, technologically, China would win the fourth industrial revolution, leapfrog the rest of the world in technology. Politically, liberal values would be no longer the normative standard in the international system, and militarily, China's military would become the world's most formidable. It would have global reach. It would have bases in the Western Hemisphere. When I worked at the NSC, my first week on the job was actually pushing back against a Chinese military base in Argentina, which we thought was not in our interests. So what does the American government, what does the American economy look like in that kind of world? Well, I think the U.S. fares better than many others, especially Europeans, but we don't fare all that well. The U.S. is probably deindustrialized, as is happening now. It would specialize in real estate, tourism, commodity export, finance, maybe if we're lucky, transnational tax evasion, because we're pretty good at that. So I don't like that world very much. A fourth alternative world is perhaps the most thoughtful one. My colleague at Georgetown, Charlie Kupchan, puts it forward as a possibility. It's a great power concert, a managed peace among the major great powers. But given China's scale, I think any successful concert is going to require the U.S. to bring real weight within that concert to balance China. And that takes us back to allied scale. You can't escape it. So when you ask the comparative question, under which of these alternatives are Americans richer, safer, or freer, under which of these alternatives are the technological revolutions we spent this conference talking about, like in AI, governed responsibly, I think the answer is probably in none of these worlds. It's only the allied scale work, an approach grounded in American alliances that I think works. And it may be battered today, but it's probably our best bet. That leads to a second point. The fact that we need allied scale, that it's better than the alternatives, doesn't mean we're going to get allied scale. And we should contextualize what we're seeing today within the history of our own alliances, which I think have endured pretty significant challenges that we often forget. Take the security picture. It's true today that the U.S. alliance structure is strained. It's also true, though, that in the 1960s, France actually withdrew from NATO's unified command and expelled thousands of American soldiers effectively from France, even amid the threat of war with the Soviet Union. So whatever we're seeing isn't that. In the 1970s, Nixon's Guam Doctrine and rapprochement with China delivered a massive psychic blow to Asian allies. And then Carter doubled down. He normalized relations and considered pulling troops out of South Korea. That's not the world we're in right now. In the 1980s, thousands of Europeans, hundreds of thousands, millions potentially, took to the streets to protest the deployment of Pershing II missiles. We're not seeing that level of mass mobilization in Europe against the United States yet. And in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, removing the very purpose of these alliances. And yet the alliances survived, expanded, and strengthened. That's a very unusual historical fact. Let's now turn to economics, because it's also true the U.S. has been battering its allies economically. Now, the Liberation Day tariffs were a serious problem. I think they've undermined the perception of the U.S. as a credible partner. But in the 1970s, as we all know, President Nixon unilaterally ended dollar-to-gold convertibility, blinding allies whose economies were anchored to the U.S. dollar, and arguably that was a larger shock. In the 1980s, Reagan's Plaza Accord negotiations forced a major currency adjustment onto Germany and Japan, arguably more significant than the current 15% tariff under the post-IEEPA Liberation Day tariff regime. More significant. And yet, we don't talk about that history as much today. The alliance has endured. Even the first Trump term, for all the alarm it produced, and I can personally attest to this, was followed by an alliance system that emerged stronger and not weaker. Under President Biden, we elevated the Quad, that particular framework. We launched AUKUS. We launched countless new plurilateral agreements, and frankly, it was easier than under the Obama administration. I'm not saying, though, that this time is going to be the same. In fact, this time might be different. We have to acknowledge that what the alliance system is facing is multiple simultaneous shocks that are unlike ones we've seen coordinated in this fashion before. But that also leads to a third point. The alliance system might be stickier than people think. On the economic side of the ledger, this is not well known, but it's worth exploring. American allies are actually increasingly dependent on the American market. China is buying less from them, and its industrial capacity is producing a second China shock that poses an existential threat to their industrial bases. So Europe now is seeing a 6% drop in exports to China and a 3 to 5% increase in exports to the U.S. We're already the top trading partner of Europe by a lot. Japan, for the first time in 20 years, sold more to America than to China. Korea, we're now pulling even with China in terms of absorbing Korea's exports, and that's with our tariffs. All of that is pretty significant. And India, don't get me started. They don't sell much to China. They sell a lot to the United States, 10 times as much. On the military side of the ledger, U.S. allies are also buying record numbers of American weapons because they're worried about their neighbors. They're co-producing weapons with the U.S., which creates enduring military entanglements. And they're building joint interoperability and warfighting capability at the combatant command level, which is unprecedented. all happening now, even under President Trump. That's not because of President Trump, it's because of the logic of politics and power that's animating them. In technology, we can discuss AI and the adoption of Chinese AI, as we did on the last panel, but American AI models and American compute still are creating dependencies that are hard to escape. And there's something else that's very unusual and striking about the moment. Even this administration, the Trump administration, can't escape the logic of allied scale. Earlier this year at the Critical Minerals Ministerial, Vice President Vance called publicly for a trading bloc among allies and partners to break China's chokehold on critical minerals. That language is the language of allied scale. And they did coordinated price controls for that purpose. And that brings me to a fourth point. The diplomatic and political layers of the alliance have been hit hard, no question. President Trump has humiliated many of our allies, sometimes with them sitting right next to him. But so much happens out of view. And when you work in government, you see that there's just such depth to the state. Some call that the deep state. But it's staffed by professionals. And those institutions operate on their own rhythm over multi-decade projects. Joint exercises are continuing, integrated command and control is happening, intelligence sharing happens, harmonization on export controls and on co-investment and industrial policy happens, all out of view, all below the radar, all with GS-15s, as we put it in the parlance of Washington, working together with their counterparts quietly. It's all still happening. And in Congress, if you go to Congress, you'll find that there's a lot of bipartisan support for the alliances. They don't buy the Trump line. So building allied scale won't be easy, and this is where I'll end. Like any good construction project, it's going to require engineers and architects. And every successful reboot of our system has required engineers and architects because you can't drive forward an allied agenda through nostalgia. You can't just look back. You have to offer something new, and allied scale is our vision, anyway, of what that new thing could be. So what do we have to do if the U.S. is going to build allied scale? I think there's probably 8 principles I'd put forward. The first one is we've got to turn the page on the Trump era, if we are so fortunate, by persuading allies that some of our most offensive policies, like just going out there on a limb, invading Greenland, were the products of personality rather than the products of our political system, which I think could be defensible. Second, we have to begin with some humility and start small projects before moving to the bigger projects. Think about a joint shipbuilding effort, critical minerals offtake agreement, a co-production line. We might focus on breaking the choke points that China has first. That's less controversial than other things. Third, we have to build mutually beneficial bargains. That means two-way flows of capacity in the allied scale framework. Allies invest in America, America invests in allies, and all give each other more preferential terms than they do to state non-market economies like China. Fourth, we have to pay attention to domestic politics. The danger of the Trump approach is alienation and polarization of allied politics that makes diplomacy impossible. Imagine an anti-American leader getting elected. That's happened multiple times because of President Trump. We have to make sure that whatever we do is grounded in domestic politics. Fifth, we have to build ad hoc coalitions. Allied scale doesn't mean doing everything with everybody all the time. It means picking ad hoc coalitions on key issues. Sixth, we've got to bolster our credibility. You can't build allied scale through what we call executive orders, unilateral presidential determinations. You've got to do it through something that's harder to reverse. That's congressional legislation. Seventh, we should build on existing platforms when possible. There are a lot of good ones, the Quad and AUKUS and the US, Japan, Korea Trilateral and the G7 and many, many others. And finally, and most importantly, and maybe most difficult, because I don't have the full answer to this yet, maybe one of you does, we have to articulate an affirmative vision, because allied scale can't just be about balancing China, it has to be about building the kind of world that we want to see and live in. That work is hard, ultimately, but I think what I've tried to show you is that it's not impossible, and the alternatives are far more concerning than the future that I'm outlining. I think the work can be done. I think it should be the task of the United States to do it over the next century. I don't think the goal, by the way, for any of this is anti-China. I think it's to balance China, form a real stable equilibrium, a balance of power. And for all those reasons, I hope it can happen. Thank you.